Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the WTO. I'm very, very glad to say a few words this morning in front of such a distinguished audience. We have several ambassadors, several colleagues and former colleagues. We're honored with so many former appellate body members here in the audience. And let me say congratulations to Joost and to Christopher and to the academic committee for putting together such an interesting conference and for gathering here in Geneva a first-class roster of speakers. Exactly one year from today, on the 8th of June of 2020, the 12th session of the WTO Ministerial Conference will be starting in Kazakhstan on the 8th of June 2020. Ministerial conferences, as you all know, are the milestones of WTO history. When we refer to Bali, to Nairobi, or to Buenos Aires, just to name the most recent ones, these names have very different meanings to us here in the WTO than sandy beaches, safaris, or tango. When we think of Bali, we mainly think about the trade facilitation agreement and the first decision on public stockholding for food security. Nairobi is mainly associated with the decisions on the elimination of agricultural export subsidies. And Buenos Aires, for many, but not for all, delegations is where the joint statement initiatives were launched. Ministerial conferences therefore reflect their time, they point to the future, and they serve as catalyzers of certain trends. What the Nur Sultan Ministerial Conference will be remembered for depends on circumstances, and it also depends on many of you. I personally believe that history, with a big H, is not merely a succession of random events. History is made of circumstances, is not made of circumstances only. Neither is it only made of people or by people and by heroes. History is made by men and women of vision who understand the circumstances and who act upon them in order to make their ideas and their vision come true. Now, this morning we will have two panels, one on the assessment of current negotiations and WTO reform discussions, and the other one on the so-called trade wars. The tensions in world trade have become a common, almost everyday headline. And WTO reform is a broad title for different initiatives in different contexts. And of course, all of this is linked somehow. The speakers in these two panels are some of the best minds in the field of world trade. I'm sure we will all benefit from their wisdom and hopefully from their ideas and perhaps from their vision for the future. And perhaps we'll be making history. Once again, a welcome to all of you. I wish you all a productive and successful discussion this morning. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm honored to be here this morning. I won't take much of the time except to show you very briefly, and Regan will go down the list, the amount of proposals that are at the moment on the table, more than 80 of them, and this is in the last sort of 6-7 months. It started, of course, with the appellate body, but soon other areas from domestic regulations, fisheries, e-commerce, developing country status. We're expecting more on subsidies, SOEs, etc. The idea is just to, as I mentioned, make you realize, go down, Regan, the amount. Many of those are still restricted. Of course, delegates can access, but some are public. Now, what I'd like us to do today is not only talk about these proposals, individual proposals, but rather, and also, the relationship between all these negotiations. And we have all read Minister Lighthizer statement at some point that the appellate body was not the only issue, although the crisis started with that. But how are all these proposals interlinked? I will start with my ambassador, Ambassador Stephen Barr from Canada. When I started 25 years ago, Canada was a big player in the Quad, and then things phased out, and with Ambassador de Boer, Canada is back in the middle of the stage with fantastic proposals dealing with institutional issues, and today I understand he will, inter alia, talk about what's happening with the Ottawa Group and their proposals. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I thought I would start off with a bit of a scene setter for the purpose of this panel, but also to set the context for the work of the Ottawa Group. And so it probably is somewhat trite to say this, but still useful to, for an audience such as this, but still useful to remind you about the sort of pressures that we are facing here at the WTO. So things like the pace of technological development, the perception that the benefits of economic growth are not being distributed equitably, political developments and decisions in the last couple of years with respect to dispute settlement and overloaded system, complaints about the appellate body operation, the U.S. blockage of appointments to the WTO appellate body, questions around China and the fact that there are some members who were saying that the rules are not designed to properly address the operations of non-market economies, and then desire by some members to continue to work and to talk through the Doha round issues, so which is preventing discussion on newer issues. And so a number of smaller group configurations have come about to try to start talking through and addressing some of these issues. And so we have the Canada-led Ottawa Group, but there are others and other configurations. There's also the EU, Japan, and the U.S. that are doing work on subsidies, technology transfers, state-owned enterprises, for example. The G20 has engaged on this. APEC ministers in their communique noted this and are trying to do some work on this as well. The other thing I would like to point out is that the issues facing the WTO are not the result of the actions of any one member, nor are they the result, as I hope you understand from what I just said, of any one specific factor. And I think sometimes we like to think in shorthand, and we like to think that it's one specific actor or it's one specific issue, and that is definitely not the case. So the Ottawa Group was formed last year around this time on the margins of the OECD, it's Saturday morning, OECD Trade Ministers meeting. And just so we're all on the same page, the group members are Australia, Brazil, Chile, the European Union, Japan, Kenya, Korea, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, Switzerland, and Singapore. This is meant to have geographic representation and developed and developing countries. The objective is to begin discussions from the ground up to look at the root causes of the issues facing the WTO, to identify possible ways to move forward, and then eventually to develop pragmatic and realistic options for consideration. It's very much meant to be a bottom-up approach. It's the only way that we're going, and needs to be a transparent approach. It's the only way to build trust in the system and come up with durable solutions. Of course, the criticism to that is that it seems quite slow. It doesn't seem to be touching on or really dealing with some of the really big issues at this point. But if we're going to have durable solutions, I think this is the only way that we can approach this. In September, Canada issued a discussion paper. It's one of the ones that Gabrielle has listed here. And we talked about the three main functions of the WTO and work that we thought needed to happen. So ways to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the WTO's monitoring function with a view towards identifying short-term actions that could be taken in that regard. Then also a discussion of dispute settlement and possible ways out of the to address some of the issues in the dispute settlement process, and then also thirdly on the negotiating function. So what I want to just briefly touch on is, ministers met in October in Ottawa. A communique was issued. It's also listed in one of these documents. Then they touched base again on the margins of Davos. And at Davos, they decided to do some work with respect to the deliberative function. They met again in Paris 2 weeks ago as a check-in. So with respect to the deliberative function, what we have been talking about is improving the way the deliberative function works, specifically around the information needs for each of the WTO councils and committees, looking at notification requirements, looking at the role of the Secretariat, improving the capacity and opportunity for deliberation, and improving opportunities and mechanisms to address specific trade concerns. So we started our work with four of the deliberative functions: the SPS Committee, TBT, Rules of Origin Committee, and the Council for Trade and Services. The reason those four were chosen, in some cases, members of the Ottawa Group were already engaging in talking about reform. And I would also point out that for SPS and TBT, it was recognized that these were very important committees that had some really useful lessons that could potentially, if examined more closely, be extrapolated to other committees. The work is not being consistently. There are different approaches to the work, I should say. The SPS work is probably at this point the most open and transparent, where Brazil, who's leading on this, has had a number of sessions for the entire WTO membership to start talking through some of these issues. The idea being that hopefully by the end of this process, all of the deliberative functions will have been reviewed, discussed, and hopefully improvements will have been identified. I should also point out that the EU is in the midst, and they've announced this a number of times, they're in the midst of drafting a paper to deal with specific trade concerns, which would be horizontal across the board, because various committees deal with this and various structures deal with this, but this would be a more holistic approach. So stay tuned, and I will leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So efforts to improve the balance between dispute settlement and deliberative functions. Ambassador Deepak from India, I'm a great admirer of India, and I remember at the very beginning of the WTO, the role of India when the US proposed ethics rules for the appellate body members to be selected, and India raised its flag and said, I want the same ethics rules for the textile monitoring body, which was unthinkable at the time. But they insisted, mini crisis, the appellate body could not be formed because of this issue. And India did win its bet, and the rules were made applicable, and the appellate body selection confirmed because it had been done on a preliminary basis first. Ambassador Deepak, what can you say to us about reforms today?
Let me start. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Let me start by thanking the G2, the Georgetown Law Institute of International Economic Laws, and the Graduate Institute Center for Trade and Economic Integration for organizing this wonderful conference. And it's always a privilege to participate in these events, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you so much. I don't think I would be sticking my neck out really if I say that these are challenging times for the WTO. Host of unilateral measures, countermeasures, increase in protectionism, the impending paralysis of the appellate body, and the attack, the never-before attack on principles which we've held dear in the rules-based multilateral system, like non-discrimination, the consensus decision-making, primacy of development, and a host of others. Maybe if we step back a little and look at this philosophically, maybe there are two ways of looking at it. One is, as the German philosopher Nietzsche would say, anything that doesn't kill me makes me stronger. So maybe the WTO is getting stronger with this crisis. The other is to go with Shakespeare. Every day, the WTO weeps, it bleeds, and each new day a gash is added to her wounds. So we are somewhere there. And as far as we are concerned, as far as India is concerned, we believe that we are in the midst of perhaps the biggest crisis that this organization has faced. The appellate body is being held hostage. Whatever may have been our positions on negotiating issues, on rules, how to implement old agreements, how to make new rules, I think the House has always regarded the dispute settlement system as a crown jewel. And today, it is in a crisis. There is a need to get it back on its feet. Merely saying and complaining that the appellate body does not follow the rules in a rule-based system, while ignoring the shall mandate which all members have agreed to in Article 18.2 of the DSU, is neither helpful nor, and it's very disingenuous. I mean, how can we block appointments for whatever reason? And I do know, and Gabriel has pointed out, there is, holding issues hostage is one way of getting some things, but that is not what we expect from responsible members. We are willing to look at specific solutions. And sitting next to David, who's spearheading the process with diligence and focus and determination, in the last 3 months or 4 months, members have come forward and offered 11 proposals listed by Gabriel. Multiple solutions to each of the issues identified by one member. But still, the member concerned refuses to really engage. Some of us might be forgiven if, and the general public outside this organization, if they feel that perhaps the interest is not so much in reforming the appellate body or the dispute settlement system, but in trying to extract some price somewhere else by not allowing it to function. There's an old saying in India, you can wake up a person who's asleep. You can't wake up a person who's pretending to be asleep. And David, you have a big task. Coming to reforms, we believe that we are the original proponents of reforms. We've been submitting proposals after proposals for the reform of the existing agreements, whether it is the agriculture subsidies, public stock holding, fisheries, disciplines and fisheries subsidies, and now motivated by the Sustainable Development Goals. However, we believe that the way to go forward is as per mandates and principles. There are specific mandates. If we follow them, rather than burdening the WTO with a whole lot of issues, in the name of modernizing or updating it, discussions are likely to flounder. The principles are, again, very important. I mean, non-discrimination, the discipline of bound rates, not using power politics, but following the rules is something which all of us hold dear and need to be strengthened and followed. Before I end, let me draw a similarity between the WTO reforms and Bollywood films. Many of you might be familiar with them. In a Bollywood film, there's lots of drama, lots of pathos, tears, action, and there's a lot of dancing. And that's how it is in WTO reforms. It's not an easy process. But again, the reason for success of Bollywood films is they usually have a happy ending. And reforms of the WTO will be successful if they result in a happy ending, by which we mean that they have to take everyone along, have to be inclusive, balanced, and sort out some of the problems that we face today. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador Deepak. Ambassador Walker, David Walker, is an economist, a panelist, of course, Ambassador of New Zealand, but heading one of the important process, the Walker process on the appellate body. And David, members are difficult, you know that. You have an enormous job. People have started whispering that it's not working, will be working. So can you solve the problem? And how? Give us a few hints.
Well, let's see. Thank you for the invitation this morning. It's good to be here, even though it is a Saturday morning. And my thanks go to Deepak for explaining to me the derivation of G2. I was wondering what it meant. It certainly is an interesting title. In any case, I'm going to just run a little bit across the agenda that is the title for this session, from a New Zealand perspective, primarily. So, much easier. I can work out what New Zealand wants. It's a bit harder to work out what everybody wants. New Zealand views the multilateral trading system as fundamental for the sustainable development and prosperity of all its members, from the smallest to the largest. The more up-to-date the rules and the better functioning the system, the greater the benefits for members will be. Currently, the system is facing significant challenges in its functioning, and the rules need to be updated and modernised. On the rules, the immediate priority for New Zealand is the negotiation on fisheries subsidies. Successful conclusion of that negotiation by December, as instructed, would permit the possibility of ministers at MC12 in 1 year's time being able to welcome the entry into force of the resulting agreement. While domestic implementation is no doubt already well in train, only through such action can WTO members collectively meet the instructions of ministers and leaders to, and this is a quote, by 2020, prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, eliminate subsidies that contribute to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, and refrain from introducing new such subsidies, end quote, as required by SDG 14.6. Also this year, as decided by ministers at MC11, WTO members are required to take decisions on extending the moratoria on customs duties on electronic transmissions and TRIPS non-violation and situation complaints. New Zealand continues to support both moratoria. The other priority, as mentioned, is a systemic one. Members of the WTO dispute settlement body are currently not meeting their collective responsibility to appoint persons to the appellate body to fill vacancies as they arise. And I know that because I'm the chair of the DSB and I hear that every meeting. In my personal capacity, I'm currently serving, as you said, Gabrielle, as a facilitator of the informal process among WTO members under the auspices of the General Council on matters related to the functioning of the appellate body. As I reported to the General Council last month, and I think everybody can read that report in Job 217, the task now is to frame possible areas of convergence in finding solutions to the issues that have been raised by members, and they have now been raised by a number of members, in order to assist the commencement of the process to making new appointments of the appellate body. Why? So that the appellate body can continue to function in a durable manner. Looking beyond this year, there are other areas of WTO rules that also need updating. Primary of these, and I'm not going to apologise for the pun, is the area of agriculture. Following the historic agreement at MC10 to eliminate agricultural export subsidies, there is a need to continue the process of reform under the Agreement on Agriculture, with the priority issue for most being the reduction in trade distorting domestic subsidies. With nothing having resulted on agriculture at MC11 in Buenos Aires, many are looking for an outcome at MC12 to bring a little bit more evenness to the playing field on international agricultural trade. One key outcome in Buenos Aires was the launch of the so-called joint initiative processes amongst interested WTO members in areas such as electronic commerce, digital trade, and services domestic regulation. Much work has been done on services domestic regulation, and negotiations proper are now getting underway on electronic commerce, with the tabling last month of a number of detailed negotiating proposals. Maybe that some of those results and other joint initiative areas can be harvested at Nur Sultan in 2020. I won't go on to the end here, other than to say the multilateral trading system, as has been highlighted, as embodied in the WTO, is certainly facing great challenges. But with challenge comes opportunity, and the current opportunity is very large indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm also optimistic. Ambassador Vallis, you are really an old, experienced trade expert, negotiators. You were ambassador of Uruguay for years. You were heading the fisheries negotiation years ago. I remember.
6 years.
Yeah, giving a presentation to your committee on relationship between these negotiations. Another thing is still on the table. And you were recently panelist in the panel that upheld zeroing. So strong views also on how the whole thing should work. So, and now you're heading a group, Latino group, fighting for this system. So give me the answer. How can we solve this problem?
We will not, to start with, but we can do a lot to avoid further damages. That's the point. We have to remain humble in this very particular and dangerous times. Look, Gabriel, I have a 5-minute speech, but I will certainly not refer to it. So, but briefly, first of all, you have listed more than 80, I think, 80 proposals for reform. In my view, we started talking about reform of this august institution since 1997. At least I have some pamphlets or some booklets on possible reform just 2 years after we started work. Now, those ideas were stemming out from people or countries that were not totally satisfied. Nobody was satisfied with the outcome of the Euro round. That was the beauty of it. But those ideas were about how to perfect, how to balance the institution. This reform that we are talking about is about how to rescue the multilateral trading system. 1st January next year, it will be a complete different atmosphere, a complete different environment if we just allow the forces and allow the status quo to continue. We cannot permit that. Gabriel, I know that you were a good friend of Julio Lacarte Muro. Julio Lacarte Muro was my master, my first ambassador in Japan 35 years ago. I know for sure how many minutes, hours, days, weeks he dedicated to the system. He dedicated that when he was 30-some years in the Havana Charter, working hard to get the consensus there. He worked hard again, wrestling against developed countries in the 60s and putting forward some disputes against 16 developed countries. He put again all his strength to come with ideas and help the institutional debate in the Uruguay round, and I cannot fail him. I cannot fail him. Sorry that I speak with passion at these times, but I think we also need a little bit of passion. Yesterday in this G2 conference, we were discussing about good faith, about trust, about the geopolitical turmoil that serves as a background to our discussions. And I say to myself, how are we going to do this if we don't put a little bit of passion? And more than passion, consciousness of the historical role that we have. This institution, this multilateral trading system has only 72 years in the full history of mankind. Are we going to allow to facts just evolve as they are, as history to pass as a succession of small events? Okay, of course, certainly we are not wishful thinking. We have big challenges ahead. That's why we came up, a little group of former ambassadors that have also the triple characteristic of having been ambassadors, policymakers and negotiators at the regional level, and also part of the Secretariat of WTO, IMF, World Bank, and in my case, UNCTAD. So we have the experience of having sat there, here, and in regional institutions, and to bring some ideas on a personal basis on what needs not only to be reformed, but what needs also to be protected. To put it as a Punta del Este group to the service of everyone, and also to act probably as a connecting vessel between governments, private sector, civil society. Because, Gabriel, in answering your question, we won't find any answer if we don't work together, if we work in this microcosm. We won't solve it because this is about a big power shift taking place, historical one. This is about multilateralism being challenged not only in the trading system, it's about multilateralism. So it's a reform within a reform. Now, the big question is, what can we do? And I think we can do a lot if we have at least one target. And that target is, let's work a little bit for predictability. Let's try to maintain all the instruments possible within this political turmoil that we have to maintain predictability. If we don't have that, we already know how much that costs in terms of GDP growth. We have seen it already. Uncertainty, it's winning the battle. So there are lots of things to do. We won't win it by ourselves, but there is a lot that we can do from all our corners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have to keep fighting. Julio Lacarte told me, he was, I think, 24 at the time, that after the Havana Charter was not ratified by the U.S., the GATT was floating here without proper institutional provisions, and apparently the UN lent a desk, 2 or 3 staff, and the GATT started and kept growing to create the WTO. So I'm an optimistic, but I'm sure you're right. We will win this challenge. Merit Jano is an amazing woman, dean at Columbia, and previous appellate body member, experts in subsidies, but also competition and other domestic issues that reveal to become more important than ever, both in the bilateral fight US-China about employments and subsidies and things like this, but multilaterally, because in order to find solutions, as it was said by Ambassador Vallis, the analysis has to be global. Merit, what can you share with us based on your great experience?
Well, thank you so much. It's really an enormous privilege to be back here. I find myself at this moment filled with profound concern and also a certain optimism. But I have to say that I also feel very conscious of being in this room, a room where I think will indelibly be in my mind for the cotton hearings I was chairing at a certain moment. And so it feels quite nostalgic. You know, from a U.S. perspective, and I live in the United States, I feel that this period we're in the United States is a period that has some echoes of the past, as well as some unique features. And the echoes of the past is the sense that the U.S. government is using reciprocity aggressively, which it has also done in the past. But what's different is that those tools are not being used simultaneously to support the multilateral system. And, you know, why is that? Is a debate that I have all the time in the United States, and I think reference was made to some of those factors, the anxiety in developed economies, the role of technology, globalization. These are things that go well beyond this administration and this moment, and I feel it is important, if we think about reform, to also be thinking about the broader context. I'm also reminded constantly how unfamiliar the young are with the role of the multilateral system and these institutions. So the case for trade, the case for dispute settlement has to be constantly remade and remade in our Congress that has so many new members unfamiliar with this history and unfamiliar with how much political capital is needed to defend it and ask why. So I guess there's a broader U.S. conversation I just bring in slightly into these chambers. But I say that there are really three areas where it seems to me this institution can and needs to address, and those are reinforcing in different ways. You know, first, I feel quite hopeful on this digital agenda. Hopeful because I think it's really increasingly important for the future. It is an inclusive agenda. It need not, you know, it's a driver of global growth. It can be a driver of inclusion. It's where I am training young people to think about how to be leaders and think about evolving regulatory frameworks around the digital economy, and that's complex because most domestic frameworks have not yet been formed. And so to develop disciplines at the multilateral level are difficult but important. So the progress on a plurilateral front or other fronts in this dimension seems to me positive and important. On dispute settlement and the appellate body, you know, I've been asking myself, is the world better off? Does it need a dispute settlement system? Does the U.S. need? And I think the answer to that is absolutely it does. It is urgent. It is a crisis, and I am glad to see these many proposals and the active debate that's underway. I think we have long known there are flaws. These have been debated for a very long time. Some of these, I left here 10 years ago, and we were talking about the constraints of 90 days, for example. And I just think that we could deal with, I have hope that this system can deal with the procedural dimensions. But they require becoming very practical. And, you know, let's take a simple one, like the 90 days. Cases are complex. If you have 45 issues in 90 days and you have to have hearings and it has to issue a report in 3 languages, you're going to have to make choices. So will you empower dispute settlement to only resolve those questions that it deems essential to resolving the case? So I just say there are practical questions to ask and answer on a number of these procedural issues that are on the table, and I feel that if the membership gets practical, those can advance. Let me just say the third area I would highlight are the structural issues around subsidies and around SOEs and other areas associated with China. Whatever happens in the U.S.-China negotiations, and I sincerely hope we reach some accommodation, it does seem to me that there are structural issues unlikely to be resolved bilaterally, and the only place those can go would be here. And so it seems to me enormously important that progress is reached, not just progress, a meaningful work program. These are not quick fixes. So I highlight those 3 areas that seem important for reform and ongoing discussion.
Thank you, Merit. I always raise the good comment made by Taipei about the 90 days. Is it really a procedural question or the choice made by members years ago to have a process of only 90 days with only 7 members? Maybe they wanted something different than a court like the ICJ, but this is just a question. Patrick Lowe is really a fox of international trade, an expert economist, a wise, a wise expert, and chief economist for years and chief of staff for Mike Moore. So he has seen all situations. Patrick, you're also African by passport and by love. You take care of developing countries since ever. So what are your views, for instance, on this new debate on developing country status or decision-making, another area where you have published a lot? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle, and thank you to the organisers for including me on this panel. I hope I don't regret it. Fox, well, I suppose that's just about all right. I just want to say, it seems to me that this discussion of trade reform would not be taking place, at least not in the form it is, were it not for the trade war. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But if that's true, then we are in a bit of a rock and a hard, between a rock and a hard place, unless we can fix the trade war. And if I just wonder how quickly that's going to happen, considering all the dimensions of it. So I think that's just a thought to start with. I want to just talk about one big idea that I think is systemic in nature and is worth thinking about in the context of reform, which is that there are 2 distinct aspects of the WTO. They're overlapping, but they're distinct. And I think that thinking about those and different ways of addressing them might be helpful in putting things back together again. One is market access and the other is rule-making. And I believe that a lot of what's going on, and particularly, for example, in the developed country divide, the S&D debate, would be better addressed if we thought more carefully about this distinction between market access and rule-making. I think what the tendency has been historically is to think of market access as too much in zero-sum terms. Market access negotiations have tended to be mercantilistic, or at least have a mercantilistic tinge. They've been informed by juxtaposing MFN and reciprocity, which clearly frustrates deals between large and small players in the negotiations, and particularly the way they're structured today. And I don't think anybody has a clean slate when it comes to market access. Everyone has their corner of concern that they do not want to open up to international competition. That's the reality. Is there anything wrong with that? As an economist, I would say not necessarily, but it's something to be thought about. So if free trade isn't an unqualified ideal, and everyone has corners of their economies which are far from being free trade, or perhaps a little more than corners, depends on the context, we could argue that everyone in market access has special and differential treatment in some sense. And I think that's really important. So I don't think we can very clearly distinguish market access from rulemaking. I mean, in subsidies it gets pretty complicated, especially when it comes to thinking about production subsidies and the need for joint action at a multilateral level. But I still think that even if it's a blurred distinction, it's worth making because WTO is clearly not the unique location for market access improvements. I don't know, I haven't done the work lately looking at it, but I would suspect that a very large chunk of market access opening has been done unilaterally, and a lot has been done preferentially. In WTO terms, I think it is true to say that with very few exceptions, no developing country has ever lowered an applied tariff rate on the altar of a WTO negotiation. Now, why is that? Playing with binding margins, yes, but actual liberalization? No, because this is not developing countries, by and large, for reasons that we could discuss, but certainly not least because of the sort of arm-twisting notion that this is the place where arms are twisted, where reciprocity and MFN seem to go hand in hand. If there isn't a domestic interest in opening, then opening doesn't happen. If it's something that a developing country is interested in, labor-intensive manufacturers, agriculture, this is a very well-known story. Whereas rulemaking, this is the WTO, the WTO has a much better record on rulemaking, and it's a unique venue for that because these rules are multilateral. So my argument is that if we paid a little more attention to thinking about how to make the rules work and a little less attention to flexing muscle over opening markets could take place in other ways, and the relationship between market opening and rulemaking is consolidation. We should be thinking harder about consolidation and less about changing the conditions of competition through forcing countries to open markets in the WTO context where they don't particularly want to. They find plenty of reasons to do it preferentially. They find plenty of reasons to do it unilaterally. And on special and differential treatment, the particular angle here, for me, is that when you get right down to it, what are the complaints that are being made about developing countries not pulling their weight? Basically, they're about market access. And yet, there are plenty of ways of complaining about other countries not pulling their weight in terms of your own export interests. So, my sense is that when it comes to the special and differential treatment debate, is this really about the rules and not stepping up to the plate in terms of rules? The way S&D is structured in the WTO and in rules matters is in terms of timeframes, definitely the presumption of convergence, and technical assistance and capacity building. Should these be so contentious? Should these be things that we're going to war over? I don't think so. So my plea is to take a little distance from the specifics of what's on the table and ask the question, are we putting emphasis in the right place as an institution? Thank you.
I love it. Thank you, Patrick. The next speaker, Ki Chang-chung, is a Korean lawyer in dispute. He is, of course, very interested by the appellate body crisis and insists on the distinction between those who view the system as a real judicial body and those who rather think that the appellate body or the review system was just to resolve dispute. We have, many of us received last night, the last EU proposal for a 25 appeal arbitration with its rules of procedure, fighting for the survival of some sort of review process. What do you think of all this, Gichang?
Thank you. And it is my pleasure to join this important session. And as a practitioner, I have three observations briefly about the appellate body reform. The observation number one, what's the nature of this crisis? The issue of appellate body reform is by its nature, it's political. But we see many proposals. These are somewhat technical to me, such as 90 days and Rule 15, etc. Proposals can be grouped into two, the easy one and difficult one, and in between. So relatively easy ones are, as I told you, 90 days and Rule 15 issues. We look into, it is almost impossible to finish the appeal proceeding within 90 days if panel report is about 1,000 pages. As already talked in this panel, if there are many issues, and how can a appellate body member can conclude those kind of review process within 90 days. So this is pretty much technical. It's not political. I think this is where the members can reach a consensus on how to, amend or just remain in this rule under the DSU. The next one is difficult ones. There will be a precedent issue and the judicial activism issue and possible external review issue on the proposal. So the problem to me is that how do you define the scope of these issues? So for example, the issue of precedent. There are needs for legitimate expectations from members in interpreting the covered agreement. But we all know that there is no stare decisis in public international law. The issue is, the question is, how do you strike a balance between the two? The other example is judicial activism. So losing party would say that panel's interpretation or appellate body's interpretation as judicial activism. So what's the boundary between the judicial activism and correct interpretation made by panel or appellate body? So the other one is in-between ones. For example, advisory opinion and standard review. I think the members can resolve on this issue and they can reach a consensus on this. So the other one is the observation number two is two clashing views. Many observe that WTO settlement has been very successful, but this current appellate body crisis could have been forecasted from the birth of the crown jewel in 1995. So I think that there are two views. The first one is that this is some kind of judicial body type thing, and the other one is somewhat arbitration type thing. So problem is that these two views are clashing with each other. So the conclusion is that facing this current crisis, WTO member must discuss what exactly we want from these dispute settlement procedures. Is it more like judicial body type one or just one-time arbitration type one? So we have to first decide this kind of question first. So the role of my last observation, number three, is the role of the dispute settlement. There are many ambiguities. Many disputes arise from the ambiguities. So an example may be the use of zeroing. So somebody must interpret. So interpreting ambiguity is an important function of the dispute settlement mechanism. So without such function, the agreement would not be enforceable. So as you all know that the DDA has been stalled, and also members never tried the Article 9.2 of the Marrakesh Agreement for the authoritative interpretation. So I think that if you want the WTO to be enforceable, you have to have very effective dispute settlement mechanism. So member must share first what's the understanding. We have to share the correct understanding of the role of the dispute settlement system. So having said that, finally, I think it is the right time to start a political discussion on the role of the DSU and whether we want a more judicial body type thing or somewhat arbitration type of a model in this WTO dispute settlement mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ki Chang. I'm not sure we need or members need to resolve this old tension, but it is a fundamental issue. Our last speaker from Singapore, Daniel Yua, from the Chambers, is also an experienced dispute settlement lawyer who will share with us perspective from a small state, because small players are not only developing countries, and whatever they each do is important for all small states. So Daniel, what can you share with us?
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation and opportunity to share on this important issue. Well, let me share my observations on what Singapore's approach will be. The context of this, obviously, is guided by the conviction that we have, as Ambassador Walker mentioned, a conviction in the multilateral rules-based system, the need for a stable and predictable environment where members, both big and small, can thrive, and also, as some would say, possibly also operate in an environment where the law is a counterweight to power asymmetries. But as a lawyer, I also recognize that the international legal order is at its heart a consent-based system. The erosion of that consent, perhaps one of the contributing factors, has led to the WTO being an institution which has been described as being in paralysis, has been described as being in a crisis. This crisis is, of course, accentuated, perhaps contributed, by the trade wars, and what seems to be an underlying lack of a strategic trust deficit, if I would put it that way. It has important implications for small states, middle economies. For the Asia-Pacific countries, this escalation in the trade wars poses the greatest risk to future growth in our region. So small states by ourselves can really do little to influence the big powers, and that's the reality. Cannot afford to act unilaterally, we are naturally disadvantaged in bilateral negotiations. But we are not without agency. The set of circumstances we find ourselves today compels us, now more than ever, to grasp or even to create opportunities to work together on issues of common interest, to strengthen our influence as a group, and to advance the collective positions on issues that actually matter. And this must clearly include efforts to reform and strengthen multilateral institutions like the WTO. And with that in mind, Singapore is playing a part in the Canadian-led Ottawa Group. What then, and how can one then grow and bridge this apparent lack of strategic trust? How do we do so? If I may borrow the words of Singapore Permanent Secretary for Trade, Gabriel Lim, he actually mentioned that in Singapore's, how would we describe Singapore's approach to the pressing issue of WTO reforms? I can describe it as the 3 Ps. The first P, purposeful. Second P, pragmatic. Third P, progressive. I can elaborate a little bit more perhaps now or later, but firstly, obviously, in terms of purposeful, yes, very quickly then. Purposefully, let's look at the issue of WTO reforms on the AB. It cannot be approached as individual issues, but really they're grounded at the core objective of the continued relevance of the WTO and the global system. A system without an enforcement mechanism really undermines what we are creating in the WTO as an institution. So the impasse is one thing we need to approach purposefully. Secondly, pragmatism is dealing with issues of commonalities. Let's not focus on differences, let's focus on where we can work together. I will elaborate on that later when there's more time. Third is, of course, progressiveness. We've heard a lot today about the progressive agenda. In particular, we're particularly concerned about the e-commerce, and I think that's very encouraging. There has been proposals on the table, large, high levels of inclusive engagement, rather ambitious suggestions as well. That's very encouraging. And if I may borrow the words of Ambassador Deepak, that offers hope that we can all star in a successful Bollywood film. We can all gain an Oscar as a result of our collective efforts. Right? But that will be all for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So a lot of food for thought from specific mandates keeping in mind WTO as a permanent forum of negotiation, trust, historical role, the young generation, and the need to remake the plea, new perspective between market access and making rules, clashing concept on the appellate body, and the PPPs. Before I go back to, not go back, but go to the floor, we have almost an hour, I would like to see whether the members on this panel would like to use a minute or two to comment on what other speakers have said, or if you prefer to keep it for responding. I know some of you would like to add a few words. Ambassador de Boer, Ambassador Deepak, yes?
Very briefly, let me come back to 3 issues. The dispute settlement system. We do believe that we need to protect what we have. And we have been proponents of the reform of the dispute settlement system since 1996. So it needs to be fixed in some ways. But let's not overdo it. Let's understand the perspective and the proportionality of the issues. 90 days, yes. I come from India, where disputes go on forever, for generations. So we value time-bound dispute settlement. But 90 days, panels take 10 years. The dispute, from the consultations to closure of many disputes, as the latest appellate body report says, take years. So if 90 days, because of increasing complexity and other reasons, is exceeded, it's not the end of the world. So we need to keep that in perspective. And the problem is, when the protector of the system becomes the tormentor, it shakes it up. The second issue is related to the unfinished agenda. Development is still a 21st century issue, Doha is 2001. And so Stephen mentioned that Doha issues are crowding other things out. I would say other things are crowding the unfinished business, which, farmers are perhaps the most vulnerable, the largest constituencies. And if there are asymmetries, they need to be looked at. They cannot be brushed under the carpet. Lastly, on e-commerce. Now, most here swear by the MTS. Some have started swearing at the MTS, but most swear by the multilateral trading system. Now, the MC11 at Buenos Aires, the last ministerial conference which we have attended, unanimously decided that the work program in e-commerce has to be a non-negotiating one, the 1998 work program. We need to understand the world of digital trade before we start freezing it or changing it. We have interests in e-commerce. We understand the benefits of it. But we believe that India, as many other developing countries, are not prepared because we do not have domestic policies and regulations to take binding commitments on rules on e-commerce. And it affects adversely the interests of small and medium enterprises. It affects adversely competition. It leads to monopolies, which go against the interests of consumers. So the point we are making is, let us understand issues, and there's lots of confusion in definitions and interpretation of ideas, and what means what. Trying to lock an unlevel playing field before people understand how it implicates, how it affects them, and then repent at leisure is perhaps not the best way of rulemaking. Lastly, special and differential treatment and the new debate on differentiation and graduation and so on and so forth. I think in a time when there's so much of divergence, this will affect trust. And it comes at a time when we are all working on the fisheries subsidies negotiations, where both the SDG 14.6 as well as the MC11 mandate specifically talk of effective special and differential treatment. Taking differential SND off the table when this negotiation is on is likely to complicate an already very complex negotiation which all of us want. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
Only just to add that these issues are very clearly seized also at the political level. We just had a gathering, an informal gathering of a very broad range of WTO ministers in Paris alongside the OECD. They had quite an explicit discussion, actually. Usually there's a bit of waffle in these meetings, but this one was actually quite, excuse my word, waffle, was actually quite engaged and quite specific, particularly around the fish subsidies negotiation and also on WTO reform more broadly. And out of that very clear commitment the need ministers recognise to finish that fish subsidies negotiation this year and make sure we have the steps in place that we can do that, and also the appellate body impasse is number one on the rest of their agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Guillermo?
Thank you, Gabriel. Just 2 quick points on commenting something that David mentioned in the first presentation on what we will be failing and what are the risks of not achieving some form of success in 1 year time and fisheries subsidies. Having been chair of that negotiation for 6 years, I would add one more important risk, David. Not only we will be failing to the mandate that we have from the ministers, more importantly, in my view, we will be really failing the very first SDG in terms of the timeline that the heads of state put in the global agenda. So it will be yet another nail in the coffin of multilateralism, more at political level. The first SDG, the first big target, SDG 14, will not be achieved at all. And that will be the sole responsibility of this organization. But yet another risk. It took us years, literally years, decades, to bring the question of fisheries subsidies to WTO. And there was only one reason for that, because supposedly WTO had teeth, had enforceability, had the experience of subsidies. It was an economic matter as well. It was not only of resources, but it was also about enforcement. If we diminish the importance of enforcement through a dilution of the dispute settlement mechanism, we will also be somehow affecting this negotiation. Last and not least, very, very shortly, I couldn't agree more about Patrick's point on conciliation, locking in, I would say, even referring to rules, the locking in effects of WTO. If that disappears, then we are in a much more anarchic world.
Thank you. So enforcement and locking commitments are crucial. Merit, you have a few words, I think.
Just one comment. I read with great interest the recent statement by the chairman of the appellate body. And if you haven't read that, I'd urge it, because it showed that the problems of timeline management and so forth are really much broader than the appellate body. If you freeze the appellate body, I think, there are profound consequences for panels and their legitimacy that we could also talk about. And I just finally say that I think Mr. Chung is correct that, there's a fundamental tension in this debate about overreach as to what the treaty interpreter is supposed to do with an ambiguous treaty text if one is not allowed to interpret the treaty. And so coming to an agreement is very hard around that set of issues.
Danielle?
Thank you. Just very briefly, the conversation that we had at this table just reflects to me that the importance of engagement and dialogue, because quite clearly there are very different views and seemingly intractable views. But that only demonstrates the need to talk, to try and understand each other's perspective. I couldn't agree more with the impassioned plea by Ambassador Vels that we got to do something. We need to be seized by this sense of urgency, and this is the time for us to do it.
This activity buzz, I've been here for over 20 years. I think the WTO has never been so busy in terms of work in committees and dispute settlement. Do you have something to add?
Just thank you briefly. Thank you, Professor Tanor. And during the Uruguay round, members did not seem to clearly envision the exact role of the DSU, including the role of the appellate body. The evidence is a DSU review negotiation. So it has been somewhat, I would say, experimental in this dispute settlement mechanism. So facing, current appellate body crisis, I think WTO member must discuss what exactly the role of they want from the WTO dispute settlement. Thank you.
Thank you. And to end, Ambassador de Boer.
Well, it's not like me to be overly pessimistic or to deliver bad news, but as much as I agree that this is an urgent matter and facing the multilateral trading system, and we need dialogue and we need to resolve these issues in a multilateral way, I would just note that not every member of the WTO system is as seized of this issue as we would like. And so I don't want people to be left with the impression that all 164 members are marching towards a new and better world. We haven't convinced all 164 members of the need of that yet. And so that is a critical problem and a critical challenge for us, and I think that needs to be acknowledged.
Thank you. So we have about 45 minutes of exchange with you. I suggest that I take quite a few questions or comments from the floor. So please come up, and then we'll go. You can identify who you would like to respond to your question. But in any case, ideally, if we have enough questions and comments, everybody will be invited to comment on the first batch of 5 or 10 questions that I'll take from the floor. So to start with, I saw James Flett. Please give your name, and we know James, but the others, your name and question, and please, for now, limit it to questions and maybe comments later on.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So I'm James Flett from the European Commission Legal Service. A very interesting panel, thank you. If I had the temerity to try and identify a consensus, I thought that all speakers talked about security and predictability, meaning for me that on the 11th of December, the lesser evil has to be identified. And all speakers seem to think that security and predictability is associated with mandatory and binding dispute settlement. So I do, of course, have in mind the proposal that the EU has just made about Article 25 of the DSU. Now, the last scene in a Bollywood film is the entire cast singing and dancing happily. But before that happens, the protagonists have to get together. And so my question to the panel, do any of the distinguished members of the panel think that they might like to dance with the European Union on a reciprocal basis?
Or among themselves. Another question there, yes, Gerardo?
Thank you, Gabrielle. We don't have 164 members, and of course, the let's say elephant in the room is the Trump administration. So, in this regard, I have two questions for both members. First, do we have 163 members at the moment? On 1st January 2021, if we no longer have a Trump administration, would we be able to recompose an appellate body if it ceases to operate? And the second question is, I guess, especially to Professor Jano. In the United States, come at the end of the Trump administration, do you believe there would be a consensus for reconstructing the appellate body? Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Yes, Anne?
Thank you, Gabrielle. Anne van Aken, University of Hamburg. I'm asking this panel because I was always wondering about it. When we talk about the so-called judicial activism of the appellate body, and member states do not like it, why do they not try to use Article 9.2 of the Marrakesh Agreement. To me, that was always unclear. I tried to explain to my students, and I hope to get an answer from you.
I saw a hand in the back there. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm Chao Liang. I'm a postgraduate student from China, and I have a question for all the panelists. If you read the President Trump's trade agenda this year, and they talk about unfair trade practices like 15 times, and most of them they are targeting China. Let's say if China compromised for the multilateral system and for all members' sake, there's still a possibility that the U.S. government just become more aggressive and refuse to cooperate. So what will happen then? Yeah, well, that's my question.
Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, Sherzod Chadhajev from the KDI School, South Korea. I have a question regarding the reforming of the dispute settlement system of the World Trade Organization. I was wondering, why not try to do a kind of another plurilateral agreement on dispute settlement, like that we have on other initiatives, based on the MFN? Is it a kind of workable option? Thank you.
Just to clarify, you want a real plurilateral?
Not real, MFN-based plurilateral.
All right, other questions? I would add one to all panelists, and then I'll ask Ambassador De Boer and others. Is it necessary to resolve the fundamental philosophical disagreement on the nature of this review process if we want to take advantage of the needed enforcement and also the locking up in negotiation? We need enforcement. We've heard it many times. So unless there are other questions, yes, Jennifer?
Thank you very much, Jennifer Hillman from Georgetown Law. I'm just curious. At this point, my sense is that the U.S. won't say, but that I believe at the end of the day what they really want is to return to the old GATT system in terms of dispute settlement, where you could block the creation of a panel in the first place if you think the issue is too sensitive to be talked about. And I think you see this very clearly in what the United States said when there was the process of creating panels to challenge the U.S. measures on steel and aluminum, where the U.S. argued don't even form a panel because this issue is too sensitive. And that secondly, they want the old GATT system where if you didn't like the outcome of the panel, you could simply block the adoption of the panel report. And if you let the appellate body go away, that's exactly where you end up, because all you need to do to block the adoption of a panel report is to file a notice of appeal, because that will have the legal effect of blocking the adoption of the panel report. So my question to the panel is whether you see, I mean, what happens? I mean, the U.S., I think, believes that the WTO can continue to thrive without a binding dispute settlement system by going back to the old GATT system of dispute settlement. And so my question for anyone on the panel is, do you agree with that? And if your answer is, as I believe Merritt's answer was, no, then why won't members consider a more dramatic response? I mean, if you think the WTO cannot continue without, then why not go to voting on new members of the appellate body or some more direct, sort of dramatic response to the situation?
Thank you. And I see another question, please.
Heng Wang from the UNSW Sydney. The question I have is actually people may argue that the crisis in the WTO reflects a fundamental gap between the Beijing consensus or the new Washington consensus, the gap between U.S. and China. But if that's the case, if the U.S. and China cannot reach agreements, what that means that it's hard to solve the problems or the crisis in the WTO. And also another question is that if we think that WTO is a better venue to discuss new rules, even if it's harder to reach between two states, would it be easier to reach agreements among 164 members? Thank you.
But I would add the WTO is also a place where alliances can be made, which cannot be done in bilaterals. And my own last question is to the members of the panel, if you want to. What do you think of this new idea? I think it comes from Jennifer, or that you could have an appellate body member that would not deal with some issues, such as trade remedies so sensitive to the US, or an appellate body that would have a chamber dealing with trade remedies, because this is the thing never discussed. We've seen the US concerns, but no explicit reference to this issue of 1762 and trade remedies. So, Ambassador de Boer, do you want to start answering what you feel like answering?
Wow. Okay, so 7, 6C, and 13 are my answers. No, this is going to be incredibly difficult to address. So I'm just going to make a number of observations, and you can take with them what you will. And these are not my government's positions, but just a number of observations about what's been talked about in the room and what we talk about in Geneva. The one is, I get somewhat concerned that because we all know the U.S. is blocking the appellate body appointments, that we then assume that the U.S. is deep sixing everything here in Geneva, and that is not the case. And so the U.S. continues to be heavily engaged in all of the work of the WTO and is pushing very hard, for example, on the fish subsidies negotiations for an agreement in December. And so I think we have a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I don't think that is particularly useful. And I think it's helpful to remember that there is heavy engagement from the U.S. in other areas. The other thing that I would note is we also tend to conflate the appellate body impasse and what's happening with the appellate body with the entire dispute settlement system. And we recognize that it is a fundamental part of the dispute settlement system, but we also run a risk because of the appointment problem that we have and because we know what will happen on December 11th, that we assume the entire system will come down to a crashing halt. And we've already seen a number of responses to this. Indonesia and Vietnam have decided to forgo appellate body review, and that is relatively controversial, but it also speaks to the understanding that elements of the dispute settlement system will continue. Now, I know that different members have different views of this, but I think it is important to remember that. The other concern that I have with respect to the appellate body discussion is that this is a very important discussion at the WTO, but this cannot be the only discussion at the WTO. There is other work that needs to be done, and we've listed across this panel, we've talked about some of the other work that needs to be done. David said there's a lot of challenges here, which also means there's a lot of opportunities. Absolutely. So we cannot let the appellate body impasse freeze us out of other aspects of the WTO work. And to Jennifer's point, absolutely, dispute settlement is fundamental, and binding dispute settlement is fundamental to our system. But let's not be, and I'm not saying that you are being this cynical, but let's not be so cynical to say we will only ever develop rules if there's an enforceable mechanism, and we will only have rules because we know that we will have to live by these rules. We should be negotiating rules because we think it's good for the system, it's good for our economies, and that we will in good faith abide by them. And so, yes, we do want binding dispute settlement, but we still should be devising rules while we're waiting to see how that works out.
Thank you. Ambassador Deepak, do you want to respond to
Just very briefly, to respond to the first question. We've been dancing with the EU. It's only that the audience is not impressed. We are co-sponsors of 752, 753. We thought we had an answer to all the problems which were put on the table. But we are told that is suggestions to move the appellate body in the wrong direction. So it's not good enough. I mean, as far as your Article 25 proposal is concerned, we haven't seen it. But we have been looking at various alternatives, though I do believe personally that it's premature to look at alternatives. All the alternatives are very poor substitutes for what we have today, and that is what we should work to protect and promote. The point that Jennifer made from here, we have the same concerns. I mean, we want an appellate body which is independent, which is, there is the two-stage settlement, automaticity, you have negative consensus. You can't block things which you don't like. And I find the idea of taking away problematic things from the remit of the AB even more problematic, because then we will never be able to agree what you take off from them. We face a number of disputes, and our constituencies will have a long list of things which should be outside the remit of the appellate body in addition to trade remedies. So that I don't think is a way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Well, maybe just quick comment on Jennifer's observations. I mean, if you take the point that's been made about good faith operation and taking what people say on face value, then the current position of the United States, as stated and as repeated by the Director General here, is that the United States wants to return the system to the way it was negotiated in 1995. And if I do my maths, that is not the GATT, that's the WTO. So that is a automaticity two-stage system which works as per the language of the DSU. So why not a more dramatic response? I think because everybody is trying to see if we can do that. So there are many proposals on the table now. Some of them were made early in the process. Others of them have been made as a result of members listening to the discussion and trying to identify where they think some landing zones might lie, or as I keep on talking about it, the ingredients for a cake. There is no better or durable alternative. If people want to think about what they might do on an interim basis if certain situations arise, then as you've heard from the EU and from Stephen, there are a number of different things that people might do. But my task is to try and help people bake the cake. And if we've got a cake and we can look at it, nobody's going to get to eat it. Clearly, unless the appointment process gets up and running again. And if anybody thinks that they need something else, some yogurt or cream or a bit of fruit on the side that's not there sitting with the cake, well then they can come along and say that at the point in time that they think is necessary to do that. It's urgent, but we still have time to sort this out, and as time gets closer to the point where consequences happen, the temperature and the focus and the urgency will start to arise. We need to sort it out as soon as possible, and that's the task that I think no one is going to step aside from ultimately, whether it's here in Geneva, or whether it's at the political level if it hasn't been solved before politicians get together. Thanks.
Thank you. And for the next one, or you, David, what's the link between the China-US tension and the current efforts for multilateral sort of solutions in your cake?
I don't know about my cake, but the general point is, I think, correct, but it's not new. Nothing came together in the Uruguay round until I think two very large members got together and decided that it was about time something happened, and they sort of knew the architecture of how it might be possible to land it. And then once that happened, all the rest of us got really busy and tried to make it happen. Maybe, history can teach us some lessons here.
Thank you. History. Guillermo.
Again on history, if you want. I'll try to address the question of 9.2. And my very simple answer is that this is linked to the very, I would say, impossibility that members had or shown in the last decade almost for not clarifying themselves what was considered constructive ambiguity in 1995. And therefore, if you wish, I witnessed that in the negotiations on anti-dumping and subsidies, okay? And as a chair, many times I told the members not to put the weight on the dispute settlement mechanism to clarify, because that could happen, but that could also bring the kind of institutional problem that we are facing now. So it's linked. It's all linked, and it's all linked about the complexity of the issues and the number of members that we have in WTO. Let's be frank about it. Consensus, universality, and complexity of the issues, it's a trilemma, it's a huge trilemma. Now, we don't find a solution by a dispute settlement that brings clarity, destructive and deconstructive clarity. That's a point. Coming to the question of dancing, I would say, well, if you put a little bit of a tango music, I would dare, meaning that we all have to participate on that. But what I would point out on the EU proposal, without going into the details, I think the idea of having something interim, that's exactly what we have to think about. But because we have a problem in front of us. And we won't solve it even if we have good news from the G2 conversations. Because that will only, sorry, I'm certainly speaking on a personal basis. I was ambassador to China as well. That will only be a truce. This process will take long, very long. We are moving from a system of convergence to a system, a multilateral system of coexistence. And to build that, it will take a long, long time. We are custodians of the little we can do for predictability. And in that sense, I see value in your proposals as we have in other proposals as well.
Thank you. Patrick.
Very quickly. I mean, I appreciate that the dispute settlement issue is really important, but I just want to remind everyone that this is a fraction of the membership that actually use it.
Yeah.
And we seem to, this tends to get disregarded. What about all the dozens who don't, and who are price takers in this system, and who care very much that the price makers can create an environment which looks after their interests? Just a reflection. I think the second point is, I really wonder whether hard law is the only highway to predictability and security. By all means, we need legislation and litigation. But that discursive, soft law part, if it doesn't exist, it's because there's no trust. And if there's no trust, it will always be about the big guys fighting each other and the little guys having very little to say about the thing. So if we aspire to being a global institution, I think we have to think beyond just litigating and legislating or doing it the other way around. I think they sometimes get confused. Somebody said that you don't have the right, or you should not, block things you don't like, and I completely agree with that. I think that's absolutely true, and that's part of the reason why I must say I'm rather partial towards MFN-based initiatives among subsectors of members, as long as they're MFN-based, as long as they're non-discriminatory. since they take the veto out of consensus. Just a passing thought. Thank you.
Thank you. So the appellate body conclusions, we all know, are having effect on all members because they have MFN outreach. And on decision-making, critical mass, you've written a lot about that, and MFN-type decisions are good. Merit, any additional comments?
Yes, thank you. I think a question, slightly provocative question, was directed to me as to what would happen at the end of the Trump administration. So let me just say that one thing this president has said is that trade wars are good and easy to win. And I think if there's a silver lining in the deep tensions we're seeing is that I think we're all getting re-educated as to the consequences of trade wars. So you're seeing new empirical work that's showing the price effects of the tariffs, of the supply chain effects, of the market effects, and of the growth effects. These are revealing themselves and altering the political economy discussions about international trade more broadly. So I think I would expect that sort of economic statecraft will change at the end of the Trump administration. But that does not mean, in my personal opinion, that there will be this underlying confidence in the WTO. I think that will have to establish itself very concretely. And so these steps that are now being considered, whether it's on appellate body or dispute settlement reform or other parts of the reform agenda, seem to me enormously important and urgent to continue to progress.
And as you said, with the young generation in particular. Danielle?
Thanks very much. Just a quick response on the focus on the appellate body and the dispute settlement. I'm speaking as a small state. I mean, I think the comment was used, that said that there's only a small proportion of members use it. But I would suggest, I would offer this perspective as a small state. It is the prospect of being able to hold a more important, a bigger economy to task. The deterrent effect is what is there. We have this philosophy, you have to be at the table or you have to be on the menu. So we have to be at the table. So that would be my 2 cents worth to that. But I think the last discussion brought me to this other perspective, which is the audience of this discussion. I mean, we're here talking about policymakers, upon lawyers, but there's a whole bigger audience outside of this room that's watching very carefully. Academics, industry. And how are we responding? Are we showing ourselves to be progressive? Remember the 3 Ps. E-commerce, for example. Where do the stakeholders come into the conversation? How do we show ourselves to be responsive to the real economic realities? Like it or not, it is an economic reality. We had a tour de force presentation yesterday on the globotics upheaval and what it could mean for small and medium-priced enterprises. It is actually an opportunity, not necessarily be looked at with fear, but with an opportunity. So I think there's a lot of conversation, a lot of education that still needs to take place. But I just wanted to bring us back to the bigger audience and the larger context in which this conversation is taking place.
This crisis is an opportunity. Ki Chang?
Thank you, Gabriel. On the questions of appellate body reform from the floor, one thing to note is that DSU reform, including appellate body reform discussion in particular, would be different from other WTO negotiations on something like such as tariff concession negotiation, in the sense that it is a procedure and neutral. So you will someday be a complainant, and you will the other day be a respondent. So I think members must take into account this aspect when they see the current appellate body reform issue. Thank you.
So we have the time, if there is interest from the floor, big 15 minutes for more questions or comments. So Joost, and then you. Yes, okay.
Thank you, Joost Pauwelijn. I'm at the Graduate Institute. and at Georgetown Law. And as one of the organizers of the conference, I of course have to express regret that the US and Chinese ambassadors who were originally on the program had to drop out. Inexplicably, they preferred the G20 in Tokyo over the G2 conference
at the last minute,
here.
you had to replace.
But it would have been really nice to complement the debate that way. I have two very quick questions. One is coming back to Ambassador de Boer, who I think rightly stressed that the US is actually, to my surprise, incredibly active, other than on the appellate body story, submitting proposals, e-commerce, fisheries, S&D. And one that attracted my attention in particular is a proposal on the notification procedures, transparency. What can we do so that members notify more of their measures? And this was a collective proposal. It's not related to the DSU, but it could be a complement to the DSU. And in there, they focus heavily on building capacity so that developing countries can submit their measures, and then to introduce some administrative measures, sanctions, in case it doesn't happen. And to me, this is a very interesting complement to formal dispute settlement, because it takes too long to go through a procedure to complain about notification. So any views on this, whether this has leverage to land? And the second question I have is, how likely is it, you think, I'm talking especially to the ambassadors, that come December 11, how likely is it that disputing parties will appeal into the void? So they know there's no appellate body. As Jennifer was saying, will members appeal anyhow? And it's almost a question of good faith. Do you think you still have the right to appeal and you'll just do it to block the process? Because if that becomes the new normal, we are not only losing the appellate body, but losing binding dispute settlement.
Yeah.
And Ambassador Valles referred to Ambassador Lacarte. You know, the other event taking place today is the John H. Jackson Moot Court competition. And I think only now do I realize what John Jackson did back in the US. It took him decades, and he wasn't alone, but it took him decades to convince the US Congress to enter into this mechanism. And my fear is that what took decades to bring about, we may lose in a couple of months. And as Jennifer was saying, someone has to do something here. And I'm not saying or calling for saving the appellate body. That was an afterthought, according to many people. I'm thinking about dispute settlement predictability. Thank you.
Henry Gao from Singapore. Everybody seems to be worried that the US and China will not be making a deal. But I'm more concerned with the alternative scenario, that is, what if they could make a deal? Because such a deal could include elements which violate the core WTO principles, such as MFN. I was wondering whether the other WTO members are just going to sit on their hands, or are they willing to do something to address this potential violation, especially the three ambassadors? Thank you.
Thank you. Victor? Yes.
Thank you, Gabriel. Victor de Prada, I work for the WTO. There's this question about voting, right? And I don't think anybody addressed this. And some serious academics and commentators have been asking the question, well, why don't members simply vote? And it's a complex issue, and it goes absolutely beyond rules of procedure in the WTO. And I have to be very careful when I talk about this, because I have the honor and the burden to be the Secretary of the General Council. But whenever I think about voting, I try to picture how that would happen in a real meeting, especially because, well, there's two types of voting. There's voting in terms of interpretative authoritative interpretations, Article 9.2 of the Marrakesh Agreement, and that some people, even very serious people, suggest that members should vote to appoint the appellate body members. That would be under the DSB. I don't know how that gets squared with Article 2.4 and footnote 1 of the DSU that require that decisions in the DSU be taken by consensus only. So I'm interested in that. But supposing that you would go to the General Council and ask for an authoritative interpretation, how would I advise the chair of the General Council? Suppose the European Union, James sends an instruction here to the ambassador and says, ask for a vote. And suppose the European Union raises the flag and said, I propose that we now move to a vote. What does the chair do? Well, the chair would have to normally establish that there is a consensus, that we can not have a consensus, and then we would have to vote. So you need a consensus, that there is no consensus, and then you can move to a vote. Now, I personally don't see that members would be willing to reach a consensus that there is no consensus. I think members would rather, and it sounds funny, I grant you, but it's not. Thank you.
Very useful comments. And recall, everybody should recall that the decision on the nomination of the DG has a very interesting sentence confirming the customary rule of decision by consensus in the WTO now on. I saw Stacy in the back. Do you have a question? Quickly, please, because I'd like each panelist to be able to comment.
Sure, yeah. Can you hear? Is that right? I'm Tracy Epps from New Zealand. I was just quite struck by Ambassador de Boer's comment about the fact that a number of members are not really seized of the urgency of the situation. So I was just interested to know from any of the ambassadors why you think that is. Is it just a general sense of inertia? Is it a lack of resources? Or is it actually something more serious, that they don't believe in the importance of the system?
Thank you. And a last question? Good. Giorgio.
Thank you. Giorgio Sacerdotti of Bocconi University, Milan. I wanted to raise two questions or issues. One is the question of the use of terminology. Words are quite important. We see in this debate, in my view or other view, a shift toward an incorrect terminology. Judicial activism is a terminology which is typical of the US debate, and it's quite not common in international adjudication. Another is advisory opinions. No one gives advisory opinions here. They don't exist, neither the panel nor the appellate body. They both decide cases in which there is a claimant and a respondent. The DSP or the General Counsel cannot ask an advisory opinion. So this wording, also in some of these proposals, should really be avoided. And we see also really bashing of the appellate body, that the appellate body oversteps the mandate, does not respect the authority given to it by its members. It's quite peculiar to think that over 20 years, 25 members of about 15 different countries appointed by consensus by all countries, members including the United States, have done these bad things.
Do you have a question, Giorgio?
Yes, 9.2 could be also used, recourse to 9.2 could also be by unanimity. The members can take the responsibility and put. Yeah. Here we see the more there are proposals, the less there is really engagement in negotiations, it seems. And I would then take the point of merit and say the US debate, the domestic debate in universities and other bodies is very important. Once upon a time, also US academics were more engaged in this, and I think you should lead, you, Merit, Jennifer, and other academics lead the field to an objective debate on the issues in the United States context. Thank you.
So, Ambassador de Boer, can we say 2 minutes each, max?
All right, I'll try to be very fast. On
There's
voting,
so much to say.
On voting, just a couple of observations. The one is, it's hard to imagine a situation where one or two members did not feel isolated in that circumstance, which I don't think is probably good for the system. I would also note that there are some other international organizations who do use voting, and I would ask you to consider as to how useful the voting has been in those other international organizations in terms of moving their work forward. I do think that the question around voting does take us to having a more meaningful discussion about what do we mean when we say consensus. Because I think in many cases consensus gets conflated to veto, and that's not what we should be thinking about when we talk about a consensus-based organization. To Yo's point about the transparency paper, there is a lot of value in talking about this very issue. This is one way to promote understanding within the system, to avoid disputes, to take pressure off the dispute settlement system. There are other examples and other work that's being done. So, for example, the EU work on specific trade concerns. That could be a very valuable avenue to promote understanding and to reduce the workload on the dispute settlement system. And to the question from Professor Gao, yeah, there is absolutely a concern that there are aspects of a deal that could actually be damaging to the system, and that's something that we will have to, if there is a deal, that we'll have to watch very closely.
Thank you very much. As a member of the Secretariat, one aspect very interesting of also Canada and EU proposal in this activity of committee is the enhanced role of the Secretariat in assisting members. That's new. And compared with the role of the Secretariat in dispute settlement, we all know that it was quite different. So that's quite positive. Ambassador Deepak.
Very briefly to respond to Professor Paulin's point, I mean, we do worry that appealing to the void will become an option. And even if it is not done, it could be a sword that hangs there. And that is the reason why we believe that the appellate body problem is not something which is going to be confined to that. It's an infection which will spread and the entire dispute settlement system will get affected and it may wither away. And that is the reason why many countries who are users of the dispute settlement system feel that this is a reform which is the first amongst a lot of other good ideas on the table. And without having the certainty of enforcement, which perhaps has been pointed out, makes WTO different from a lot of other talking shops in the multilateral system, not only will it affect the allegiance to rules, but also the ability or the intention or devoting resources to formulation of new rules. So it's going to affect the whole system very quickly. It's more insidious than we can imagine.
Thank you. David?
Well, perhaps just to observe that however it might look from the outside, this discussion about reforming the functioning of the appellate body is not just about an appellate body bashing exercise. And also, there's a lot of hard issues, but there are no easy issues. So if you take something that looks apparently easy, like 90 days, for example, if we are to squeeze the system back into the original box as it was designed, and there's all sorts of reasons, why people think it was designed that way, if we do that, yes, it will have implications for appellate body members on a division, but it will have profound implications for how members look to use the appellate body system as they think back on what really did they mean when they wrote that in 1993 and 4. Thank you.
Thank you. Guillermo?
Thank you. On notification procedures, I think that we believe in the Grupo de Punta del Este with the experience of having been representatives here, but also having worked in different secretariats, that a lot can be done precisely to help on predictability beyond what we will look into in DSU. And we have several proposals. This is a marketing opportunity for me. So it's www.grupopuntadeleste.com. And we came up precisely with some proposals, not only on notification, but also on monitoring single countries and monitoring processes. And again, Marcel, I think you are absolutely right. There is room of maneuver for the Secretariat. I wonder sometimes why we don't use the leeway that we have according to the rules without stretching too much the monitors. It's a question of recognition of what the Secretariat needs to do. To conclude, voting, I worked in the UN and I know what that means. Voting, depending on what, when, and how.
Thank you. Patrick.
Okay. Just on this dispute settlement and access to it, I think we should always remember how costly it is for countries. So it isn't necessarily the way things are structured accessible to all. And actually thinking about dispute settlement and it working, is there not, really, given the difficulty of taking effective punitive action, isn't there really a case where actually a kind of soft law attitude to the world is required for the dispute settlement system to work? Just a reflection. I can't agree more with Henry Gao, unusual this, I must say, about the risks to the system of deals amongst major players. And thinking of that, I'm not a lawyer, but I kind of understand that just about everyone affected by the trade war, everyone implicated in the trade war has done something which would be dubious in legal terms in the WTO, including those that have signed voluntary export restraints. So, I think there is a risk of a rot which will be hard to fix. And finally, when we were siblings and used to fight with one another, my mother always used to say she didn't want to really apportion blame. We were always looking to her to tell us who was right and who was wrong. She would say, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. And I'm reminded of this when I hear conversations about what to do about dispute settlement. Thank you.
Thank you. Merit?
Well, this has been a wonderful, rich conversation. Hard to know where to land in a final thought. I would just say, having looked at this for all of 2 minutes, I would just say I appreciate
The EU proposal
the EU
on 25.
proposal. I do appreciate trying to come up with something practical given the looming December deadline. And it does look like it is a way forward as one option. I know there are others that we haven't talked about today, and I appreciate those being on the table. But I do think that, there's always a risk that if you also start something as an interim, it takes on a life of its own. So that's another worry that one would have about any alternative that isn't more lasting.
Thank you. Danielle?
Thank you. Just to say that the issues are clearly quite complex. There are no easy issues here. But we should still continue to plot ahead and plow ahead. And in the context of the DSU and the context of the AB discussion, we are at this inflection point where we really have to be open to look at various proposals on the table. Certainly premature to land on any or to pronounce any specific pronouncement on any interim proposal right now, but there are proposals to help us collectively guide towards what is looming ahead without at the same time losing sight of what General has just mentioned. Interim can sometimes become permanent, so we need to maintain the balance. What is the purpose we're heading towards at the end of the day?
Thank you. Ki Chang?
Thank you. Very briefly, I think the WTO members are in the process of crafting the jewel of the crown. So it's not a complete system. So I think the member countries must, try their best effort to the better shape of the jewel of the crown. Thank you.
Thank you. So a lot of food for thought. I'd like to start with thank you all of you in the room, because we are here for you. And thanking, of course, this outstanding panel and panelists, thanking the organizer. I would also like to remind you that the WTO bookshop is open now, and it will be open over lunch. Lots of books to give you ideas, and there's a coffee. And please help me thank all the speakers, and let's hope that we will continue this discussion. I'm personally convinced we will win this challenge, although it will be difficult.